On a still heavy June night in the mid-1990s, the upscale neighborhood of Rowlett, Texas slept behind manicured lawns and porch lights. Nothing in that quiet suburb suggested danger. But just after 2 in the morning on June 6, 1996, a piercing, panicked voice cut through the calm. A young mother, 26-year-old Darlie Lynn Routier, was sobbing into the phone, gasping out a message that froze dispatchers. Someone, someone stabbed my babies. When officers raced to the elegant brick house on Eagle Drive, they expected a burglary gone wrong. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. In the family's living room, normally filled with toys, blankets, and the soft chaos of young children, 6-year-old Devin lay motionless on the carpet, his small torso covered with deep stab wounds. Nearby, 5-year-old Damon, gravely injured, tried to breathe through the blood, filling his lungs. Paramedics fought to keep him alive, but he slipped away within minutes. The living room looked like a battleground. Blood coated the floor, the couch, the walls, thick, violent arcs that told a story long before anyone spoke. Darlie herself was also wounded. She had gashes along her arms and a dramatic slice across her throat, stopping just short of a major artery. Her blonde hair was matted with blood. Between coughs, she insisted an intruder had attacked her and her sons while they slept downstairs to escape the summer heat. She said she woke up to a shadowy man standing over her and chased him through the kitchen as he escaped into the garage. For a moment, her story seemed plausible. The Routiers were not strangers to attention. They were a young, attractive couple with 3 boys, a home that looked magazine-ready, and a lifestyle built around projecting success. Darlie, with her big hair, bright smile, and charismatic presence, was often described as the quintessential all-American mom. Her husband, Darren, was a computer businessman who once enjoyed booming profits. Together, they cultivated an image of prosperity, a sports car, a backyard pool, and kids who always seemed happy in photos. But investigators quickly spotted red flags. The garage window screen supposedly cut by the intruder had layers of dust and cobwebs that seemed untouched. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing removed from the home, nothing broken. And when detectives tested the kitchen knife found in the sink, they uncovered tiny fiberglass particles matching the very screen that had been sliced. To them, it suggested staging. Their suspicion deepened when doctors examined Darlie's injuries. Medical experts would later testify that her wounds looked superficial, more like controlled cuts, than the chaotic damage expected from a violent struggle with an armed stranger. Still, the case might have remained murky until a video surfaced that would brand Darlie forever. 8 days after burying her sons, the Routier family visited the cemetery to mark what would have been Devin's 7th birthday. Some relatives brought balloons, some prayed. But when cameras captured Darlie laughing, spraying cans of silly string, and singing happy birthday, the footage ignited national outrage. Prosecutors preparing for trial played that tape again and again, insisting it showed the true Darlie, callous, detached, maybe even proud. The defense countered that earlier that day she had broken down weeping uncontrollably at the gravesite and that the silly string celebration was a way to honor a child who loved birthdays. But the damage was done. The public had made up its mind. The trial began in January of 1997, moved to Kerrville due to overwhelming publicity. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors painted Darlie as a mother, cracking under the weight of debt, insecurity, and the strain of caring for 3 young boys. They argued she killed Devin and Damon for relief from financial pressure, relief from emotional burnout, relief from a life that no longer fit the glamorous image she once projected. The defense delivered a very different narrative. They described a loving, attentive mother who adored her sons, who would never hurt them. They claimed Rowlett police botched the crime scene, ignored potential leads, and latched onto Darlie too quickly. They pointed to a bloody sock discovered yards away from the home, something they argued Darlie could not have planted without leaving the dying boys alone for several minutes. They accused the state of twisting grief into guilt. But in the end, the prosecution's story in that cemetery tape proved more powerful. In February of 1997, the jury found Darlie guilty of murdering 5-year-old Damon. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of the rare American women on death row. She was not tried for Devin's killing, though that charge remains. Public reaction split sharply. Some saw Darlie as a monster, hiding behind peroxide hair and suburban charm, a mother who violated the most primal human instinct. Others saw a tragic figure condemned by flawed forensics, questionable police work, and one disastrous moment caught on camera. As years passed, her case refused to fade. Documentaries, books, and investigative shows picked apart the evidence. Supporters highlighted inconsistencies, unidentified fingerprints, the mysterious sock outside new DNA tests that raised new questions but resolved few. Critics pointed to the forensic blood spatter analysis, to the knife, to the wounds they believed were self-inflicted. Darlie has now spent more than 2 decades on Texas death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. She still insists she is innocent. Her appeals continue slowed by the grinding machinery of the legal system. Each petition sparks debate. Is she a victim of tunnel vision or a manipulative killer maintaining her innocence because the truth is too monstrous to face? The Routier case lingers because it unsettles us. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Grief does not look the same on every face videos capture, only fragments, and even in the most ordinary neighborhoods, darkness can grow quietly behind picture-perfect smiles. To this day, the story of Darlie Lynn Routier remains one of America's most polarizing true crime mysteries, an unsettling reminder that even after decades, the line between guilt and innocence can remain blurred, and justice can feel as fragile as the lives lost on that terrible June night. The boy did not look like a runaway. He looked like someone who had escaped. Barefoot and filthy, his skin stretched tight over fragile bones, he stood shaking on a neighbor's doorstep in Ivins, Utah. He was supposed to be 12 years old, but his body told a different story. He looked younger, smaller, like a child who had been worn down by something relentless. He did not ask for money. He did not ask to use a phone. He asked for food. He asked for water. He asked for help. Then in a voice that barely held together, he said his mother's name. Ruby Frank. The neighbor did not hesitate. He called emergency services immediately. In the recording, disbelief cracked through his words as he described what stood in front of him, a starving child with tape around his legs begging for help. When deputies and paramedics arrived, they saw exactly what he meant. The boy's wrists and ankles were marked with deep wounds where rope had been bound too tightly for too long. Some injuries were open, raw, and untreated by any medical professional. Instead, they had been smeared with a paste made from honey and cayenne pepper, a mixture meant not to heal but to burn. This was not discipline. This was captivity. As officers secured the property the boy had escaped from, they made another discovery inside the house. A younger girl, barely 10 years old, was found sitting inside a nearly empty closet. She was emaciated, terrified, and silent. She did not run. She did not cry. She barely moved. When offered food, she hesitated as if eating without permission carried consequences. Her body language told investigators everything they needed to know. This was a child who had learned that invisibility was survival. That moment marked the collapse of a carefully constructed image. For years, Ruby Franke had been known to millions as a strict but principled mother. Through her popular family channel, she presented herself as an advocate of discipline, structure, and moral parenting. Viewers watched her raise 6 children under rigid rules. She spoke openly about taking away bedrooms, withholding holidays, and enforcing harsh consequences for misbehavior. Critics raised concerns. Supporters pushed back. Ruby insisted she was teaching responsibility. But behind the scenes, her parenting philosophy was evolving into something far more dangerous. Ruby had aligned herself with Jody Hildebrandt, a self-described life coach, whose teachings centered on obedience, repentance, and the idea that children were naturally manipulative and morally corrupt. Together, the two women began isolating Ruby's children. Contact with their father was severed. Schooling stopped. Outside influence disappeared. Anyone who might ask questions was pushed away. The house in Ivins was not a home. It was a controlled environment. Investigators later discovered a room designed not for comfort but for containment. A small bed, a toilet, a microwave, chains, rope, handcuffs. It was described as resembling a panic room, but functioned more like a holding cell. Prosecutors would later characterize it as a work camp environment where children were forced into physical labor, denied adequate food, and punished under the justification of moral correction. Every act of cruelty was framed as necessary. Ruby and Jody believed the children were sinful, deceptive, even possessed. In journals recovered by investigators, Ruby wrote about her children as if they were enemies rather than dependents. She described withholding food deliberately. She documented punishments meant to break resistance. She wrote that suffering was required for repentance. The boy who escaped that night did more than save himself. He exposed everything. Search warrants followed quickly. Law enforcement documented the injuries. They collected the rope and tape. They photographed the room. They seized the journals. Interviews with the children painted a picture that matched the physical evidence. Prolonged starvation, forced labor isolation, and psychological manipulation framed as religious discipline. Years of online speculation suddenly hardened into fact. Ruby Franke was arrested the same day her son escaped. Jody Hildebrandt was taken into custody that night. Both women were charged with multiple counts of aggravated child abuse. Eventually, each pleaded guilty to a reduced number of charges, sparing the children from having to testify in a full trial. At sentencing, Ruby wept. She apologized. She claimed she had been manipulated, misled, and mentally overtaken by Jody's teachings. She said she lost sight of herself. But prosecutors were prepared. They had her journals, they had her words, they had her handwriting. They showed that Ruby was not a passive participant. She documented the punishments. She justified the starvation. She believed in her own words that her children needed to suffer in order to be saved. Under Utah law, aggravated child abuse carries a wide sentencing range. Instead of fixed prison terms, the state uses an indeterminate system. The judge imposed multiple consecutive sentences, meaning Ruby will serve a minimum number of years before becoming eligible for parole, with a maximum cap determined by state law. The parole board will ultimately decide how much of that time she serves. Jody Hildebrandt received the same sentencing structure. Neither woman has a guaranteed release date. Their futures are now controlled by the same system of oversight and evaluation they once believed they were morally entitled to impose on children. The online videos remain, viewed now through a lens Ruby never intended the world to use. What once appeared as strict parenting now reads as warning signs, hiding in plain sight. A lesson repeated across true crime history: abuse does not always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks organized. Sometimes it looks moral. Sometimes it hides behind confidence, community respect, and a camera lens. The boy who knocked on that door did not just escape a house in Utah. He shattered an illusion watched by millions. And he reminded the world of something uncomfortable but essential. When ideology becomes more important than a child's humanity, cruelty is never far behind. In upstate New York, in a neighborhood where people rarely lock their doors, and everyone knew the sound of their neighbor's car engine, there lived a woman who seemed followed by heartbreak. Residents of Schenectady often said Mary Beth Tinning was a magnet for tragedy, a mother who had walked through more grief than any person should ever bear. Not even the oldest families in town could recall another home where so many tiny lives ended so soon. For years, she inspired sympathy casseroles and whispered prayers. But the compassion she received was built on a lie. Mary Beth Rowe came into the world in the early 1940s. Her childhood was marked by emotional bruises rather than physical ones. She grew up hearing that she had been an unwanted baby, a message repeated often enough that it eventually became the foundation of her identity. She learned early that the only time she received attention, any kind of attention, was when something terrible happened. That pattern would follow her into adulthood in the most devastating ways imaginable. She married a quiet blue-collar man named Joseph in the mid-1960s. To the community, they looked like any other young couple building a future, a small house, modest income, dreams of a growing family. Neighbors would later recall how Mary Beth enjoyed being comforted, how she would soak in sympathy the way other people might enjoy compliments. At the time, no one thought much of it. When their first baby died shortly after birth in the early 1970s, people stood by her. When the second child passed unexpectedly, not long after, the town again surrounded her with support. But then came the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each death explained as illness or crib death or the kind of freak misfortune that families pray never touches them. Meals were left at the door, condolence cards stacked up. Mothers from church cried with her. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, unsure what to say to a woman who had endured so much loss. Others whispered that the Tinning home must simply be cursed. But year after year, another child died, sometimes an infant, sometimes a toddler, who had been running around the yard the day before. Each time, Mary Beth cried. Each time, doctors looked for medical explanations. And each time, nothing concrete appeared. By the time the family had lost far more children than anyone could justify through natural causes, a few people privately wondered whether something else was happening. But who would ever accuse a mother, especially a mother who had endured such heartbreak, of harming her own children? The idea was too awful for most to say out loud. The death that finally broke the silence came in the mid-1980s when Mary Beth's last baby stopped breathing in her crib. Investigators, now familiar with a long history of unexplained losses in that household, could no longer accept coincidence. They began asking questions that hadn't been asked the first time, or the fifth time, or even the eighth. During questioning, Mary Beth wavered. Then piece by piece, she admitted that at least some of the deaths were no accident. She described smothering one baby because the child was crying. She admitted taking the life of another because she felt overwhelmed. She acknowledged ending the life of her youngest child. Her words were calm, almost detached, as if she were recounting chores rather than the destruction of the lives she brought into the world. She did not take responsibility for all 9 deaths, but investigators no longer needed her to. A truth had finally emerged from beneath more than a decade of staged grief. Her husband Joseph never wavered publicly. Through every court hearing, every headline, every accusation, he stood beside her, insisting she was misunderstood, insisting she was incapable of what she had already admitted. Some believed he was terrified to confront the truth. Others thought denial was the only way he could continue living with the memories of the children they had buried. Mary Beth was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to a term of 20 years to life. Behind bars, she behaved quietly and without incident, though she rarely acknowledged the full extent of what she had done. Year after year, parole boards rejected her request for release, citing her refusal to accept responsibility. That changed in the late 2010s, when she was finally granted freedom at more than 70 years old. Her release reopened old wounds in Schenectady, a place where 9 graves still mark the shadows of her past. Many residents believe she should never leave prison. To them, no punishment could ever match the magnitude of what happened in that small house on a quiet street. Today, Mary Beth's name is spoken in hushed tones in true crime circles, not because she shocked the world with brutality, but because she hid her cruelty behind the softest mask imaginable, the image of a grieving mother. She taught investigators and doctors a painful lesson that repeated infant deaths cannot be dismissed as tragedy alone. Her case changed how pediatricians evaluate sudden deaths and how experts recognize patterns of harm within families. Mary Beth Tinning's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it cries in the front row at a funeral. Sometimes it looks like heartbreak. And sometimes it lives in the very place a child is supposed to be safest, their mother's arms. Gabriel was 8 years old. At an age when most children worry about spelling tests or scraped knees, he was worrying about survival. He was small for his age, quiet, polite, and desperate to be liked. Teachers described him as gentle. Family members remembered him as affectionate. He still wrote notes in uneven handwriting. He still believed, at least for a while, that adults existed to protect him. For most of his early life, Gabriel lived with relatives who fed him, clothed him, and tried to give him stability. But in the fall of 2012, the system decided that he should be returned to his biological mother, Pearl Fernandez. Multiple family members objected. They warned social workers that Pearl had a violent history, that she was unstable, that Gabriel would not be safe. Those warnings were documented, they were acknowledged, and then they were ignored. Shortly after Gabriel returned to his mother's apartment in Palmdale, Pearl's boyfriend, Izoro Aguirre, moved in. According to later testimony, the atmosphere in the home changed almost immediately. What followed was not discipline or loss of temper. Prosecutors would later describe it as systematic, intentional torture. Gabriel was beaten regularly. He was punched, kicked, and struck with objects. He was burned. He was shot repeatedly with a BB gun. Medical examiners later found pellets still embedded in his body, including one lodged in his lung. He was starved while others in the home ate normally. He was forced to sleep bound inside a small cabinet, sometimes gagged, sometimes unable to move for hours. The abuse was not hidden in isolation. Gabriel went to school covered in bruises. His teacher noticed. Counselors noticed. He spoke to deputies. He spoke to social workers. He explained in a child's simple language that he was being hurt. He said he was locked away. He said he was not allowed to eat. He said he was shot. More than 60 reports were generated. Hotline calls, written warnings, home visits. A risk assessment tool flagged his case as severe. A supervisor reduced the rating. Files were closed. One deputy responded to a call and left without speaking to Gabriel at all. Later investigations would accuse two child welfare workers of falsifying records. Each time Gabriel reached out, the system sent him back to the same apartment. Inside that home, the abuse took on another layer. Pearl and Aguirre repeatedly labeled Gabriel as gay. They mocked him for perceived femininity. They punished him for it. Prosecutors later argued that hatred fueled much of the violence, particularly from Aguirre, who expressed open contempt while inflicting harm. Investigators concluded that the label was used not as an identity, but as a weapon. Despite everything, Gabriel kept trying. He wrote notes promising to behave. He tried to prove that he was good. After his death, his teacher found one of those notes in his desk. It was not a cry for help. It was a child asking for approval. In late May of 2013, emergency services were finally called. Not because the abuse had stopped, but because Gabriel's body could no longer endure it. Paramedics immediately recognized that Pearl's explanation did not match what they saw. Gabriel was unresponsive. He was flown to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where doctors worked to save him. The injuries were catastrophic. 2 days later, he was declared brain dead. Life support was removed. The investigation moved quickly. Medical evidence contradicted every version of the story Pearl attempted to tell. Witnesses came forward. Records surfaced. When detectives questioned Aguirre, his responses were disturbingly flat, devoid of emotion. Both adults were charged with murder with the special circumstance of torture. Pearl Fernandez ultimately pleaded guilty, avoiding the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aguirre went to trial. Jurors were shown photographs. They heard forensic testimony describing injuries that could only have come from prolonged deliberate abuse. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed. Aguirre was sent to death row, where he remains. But the case did not end there. The spotlight turned toward the institutions meant to protect Gabriel. Several social workers and supervisors were criminally charged for failing to act in falsifying documentation. Though those charges were later dismissed on appeal, the fact that they were filed at all reflected the scale of the failure. Multiple sheriff's deputies faced discipline. Policies were questioned. Reforms were promised. Years later, a documentary series exposed the full timeline to the public. Every ignored warning, every missed opportunity, Gabriel's story became a symbol of what happens when responsibility is fragmented and accountability disappears. Yet beneath the outrage and the policy debates, one truth remains impossible to escape. Gabriel did everything a child could do. He spoke up. He told the truth. He trusted adults. And every time he was sent back. This was not just a crime, it was a betrayal, not only by a mother and her partner, but by a system that heard a child's voice and chose silence instead. Evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person a child is taught to call home. And sometimes it comes from everyone who looks away. What happened to her was slow, calculated, methodical. Her death was the final chapter in a campaign of control that unfolded quietly behind closed doors while warning signs piled up and were repeatedly explained away. When Angela McCanney regained custody of her teenage daughter, after years of instability and prior abuse concerns in California, the system framed it as a second chance. Jeanette was no longer a small child. She was seen as old enough to speak for herself, old enough to resist, old enough to run if things became unbearable. That assumption would follow her straight into the grave. From the outside, the changes were subtle at first. Teachers noticed bruises that did not match the explanations. Friends noticed Jeanette was always hungry, always exhausted. Classmates saw how she flinched when someone moved too fast or stood too close. She withdrew, shrinking into herself, doing what abused children often do best, surviving quietly. Reports were made, phone calls were placed. A friend's parent contacted child services. Angela's own mother-in-law repeatedly called abuse hotlines, begging authorities to intervene. Each time the response stalled. Jeanette was a teenager, they said, not a toddler, not an infant. She could talk. She could leave. The files were closed. The system moved on. Inside the home, Angela McCanney was tightening her grip. Food became a weapon. At first, it was rationed. Then it disappeared altogether. The pantry was locked. The refrigerator was off limits. Even the kitchen sink was cut off. Jeanette drank water wherever she could find it, from the dog's bowl, from the toilet, from any container that held liquid. Hunger was no longer discomfort. It was a constant burning presence that hollowed her out from the inside. Jeanette no longer slept in a bed. She slept on a piece of cardboard laid directly on the floor. This was not because the family lacked resources. It was because Angela did not want blood soaking into the carpet. That cardboard absorbed everything. When detectives later tore it up, they found staining that reached into the subfloor beneath. They would also learn that similar damage had been left behind in a previous home, a sign that this pattern had followed Jeanette from place to place. Punishment became ritualized. Jeanette was forced into stress positions for hours at a time, arms raised back, arched muscles shaking. If she moved, she was beaten. The purpose was not discipline, it was domination. And yet Jeanette endured. She woke up each morning, she stayed quiet, she kept her head down, she did everything she could to survive. The night before her death, Angela struck Jeanette in the head with a stick. There was blood. Instead of calling for help, Angela told her younger daughter to clean it up. The household returned to routine as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. By morning, Jeanette was clearly in medical crisis. She was cold to the touch. She spoke incoherently. She could barely stand. Any reasonable adult would have recognized the emergency. Angela did not take her to the hospital. Instead, she left the house to get food, leaving Jeanette alone on the cardboard, critically injured and dying. When Angela returned, Jeanette could no longer speak. It was not Angela who called for help. It was Angela's mother-in-law, Lynn, who saw the condition Jeanette was in and demanded immediate action. Paramedics arrived quickly, but what they found was beyond saving. Jeanette Maples was pronounced dead that night. The medical examination that followed stunned even seasoned professionals. Jeanette's body was profoundly emaciated. She had virtually no body fat and almost no muscle tissue left. Her body bore hundreds of injuries, some fresh, others long-healed, marking years of sustained abuse. At an age when teenagers are still growing, she weighed scarcely more than a small child. Physicians later said her appearance resembled survivors of wartime starvation camps. Detectives with decades of experience described it as the worst abuse they had ever seen inflicted on a living child. Angela McCanny did not contest the facts. On the very first day of court proceedings, she pleaded guilty to aggravated murder. There would be no trial over what happened. Only a decision about punishment remained. During the penalty phase, Angela addressed the jury. She apologized. She said she never intended for Jeanette to die. But intent no longer mattered. The jury had seen the photographs. They had walked through the house. They had stood in the room where a teenage girl slept on cardboard soaked with her own blood. They listened as emergency responders described the moment they realized Jeanette could not be saved. The sentence was death. Angela McCanny became the first woman in Oregon to receive a death sentence since capital punishment was reinstated in the mid-1980s, and the only woman on the state's death row at that time. Years later, as Oregon narrowed the scope of capital punishment and effectively abandoned executions, her sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die behind bars. Jeanette's stepfather, Richard, pleaded guilty to murder by abuse for failing to protect her. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole decades later. Jeanette Maples became the center of one of the most brutal child abuse cases in Oregon history. Her case is now taught in professional trainings across the country. It forced child welfare agencies to re-examine how they evaluate older children, how they respond to repeated low-level reports, and how dangerous it is to assume that silence equals safety. Jeanette did not die because nobody noticed. People noticed. They worried. They called. They documented. She died because the system hesitated. Her story stands as a warning. Abuse does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like paperwork closed too soon, assumptions left unchallenged, and a teenager who survives just long enough for everyone to believe she will survive on her own. Jeanette Maples deserved protection. She deserved intervention. She deserved to be believed. And she deserved to live. In the mid-1990s, a vibrant young athlete from Sydney named Kelly Lane appeared unstoppable. With her athletic build, blonde hair, and fierce drive in the pool, she dominated in women's water polo. Teammates and coaches whispered that she was destined for national and perhaps even Olympic glory. Outside the water, she had a magnetic social life, part of Sydney's youthful, carefree party scene. To those who knew her, she was energetic, beautiful, and full of promise. But behind the image of the ambitious, spirited sportswoman lay a secret that would unravel everything. Between 1992 and 1999, Lane experienced multiple pregnancies, some ended in abortion, some in adoption, and most shockingly, one resulted in a child who vanished without a trace. The baby, a daughter named Tegan Lane, was born in September of 1996, yet just 2 days after birth, she disappeared from Lane's life forever. On September 12, 1996, Lane delivered baby Tegan at a hospital in Western Sydney. Official records confirmed the birth. 2 days later, she left hospital, reportedly carrying Tegan. But by the time she reached her parents' home, Tegan was nowhere to be found. Later that very same day, Lane attended a friend's wedding, dressed in white, socializing, as though nothing important had happened. No baby, no mention, no hint, as if the newborn had evaporated. For years, the secret remained buried. In 1999, another adoption triggered scrutiny. Authorities realized Lane's pattern of hidden pregnancies. Investigators began doubting her explanation that Tegan had simply been handed to the baby's father, a man she at different times named Andrew Morris or Andrew Norris. Police tried to trace him. They found no credible record. They found no sign of Tegan. No body, no caretaker, no paperwork. Faced with mounting doubts, authorities reopened the case. By 2003, police were questioning Lane repeatedly. She provided inconsistent stories. Sometimes she claimed the father had the baby. Other times she said she could not remember details. The contradictions piled up, and in the absence of any confirmed caregiver or any trace of the child, investigators concluded only one scenario made sense. Tegan had died shortly after birth, and Lane was responsible. In 2010, Lane's story went to trial. The courtroom became the center of one of Australia's most sensational and controversial cases. Prosecutors argued that Lane saw the baby as a threat to the life she wanted: her sport, her youth, her freedom. A child, they said, would wreck her Olympic dream, disrupt her social life, and shatter the carefully maintained illusion. According to that narrative, Lane left hospital with Tegan, but disposed of her soon after, perhaps at a nearby site linked to the upcoming Olympics, before attending the wedding later that day. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. No body, no forensic proof of violence, no sign of life for Tegan beyond those 2 days in hospital. The prosecution leaned heavily on Lane's pattern of deception, secret pregnancies, conflicting stories, adoption lies, and on the idea that no credible alternative explanation existed. The defense maintained Lane's innocence. They argued that she had given Tegan to the father, or that the infant had been raised secretly by someone else. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence, the absence of a body, and insisted there was no proof of malicious intent or harm. Nevertheless, after weeks of testimony, the jury convicted Lane. In December of 2010, she was found guilty of murdering Tegan and of multiple counts of perjury or false statements related to her adoption declarations. A court sentenced her to a maximum of 18 years in prison with a non-parole period of 13 years and 5 months. Her appeals were rejected. A request for her conviction to be overturned was denied by the highest court in August of 2014. To this day, nobody has located Tegan. Her body has never been discovered. The man Lane identified as the father remains untraceable. Lane herself, in phone calls from prison, continues to insist she did not kill her daughter, that she gave her away. She says she simply doesn't know what happened after she left that hospital. If I could help free myself, I would, she says. But under recent reforms in New South Wales found known as no body, no parole laws, Lane remains locked up. As of spring 2024, a parole board formally denied her release, concluding she had not cooperated sufficiently to help locate her daughter's remains. Without a body, without cooperation, she must serve out the full sentence. Her parents, once proud of the bright young athlete, have become vocal supporters of her cause. They publicly declared they do not believe their daughter would harm a child. They maintain she has been demonized by media and public opinion. Some advocates for criminal justice reform draw parallels between Lane's case and others that hinged on circumstantial evidence and missing bodies, cautioning that convictions without physical proof tread a dangerous line. And so the case lingers. Part true crime, part tragedy, part mystery. On one side is a once promising athlete, convicted and imprisoned, her fate sealed by absence of a body, of a trace of certainty. On the other side is an unknown motherless child, a missing little girl who would now be an adult had she lived. No record, no reunion, no closure. For those who follow true crime, the Layer case remains deeply unsettling. It forces us to ask difficult questions about justice, proof, and guilt. What happens when the only evidence is silence? When the answer depends on absence rather than presence? How solid does a case built on secrets, lies, and inaction truly stand? But beyond questions of law, there is heartbreak for a life never lived, for a mother haunted by uncertainty, for a family torn between loyalty and despair. And perhaps most chillingly, for the idea that sometimes the most disturbing crimes are the ones that leave no visible trace at all. Daniel Pelka's life was not marked by a single moment of violence, but by years of quiet suffering that unfolded in plain sight. His story is not only one of cruelty inside a home in Coventry, England, but also one of repeated warnings, ignored assumptions left unchallenged, and a child who vanished into silence while surrounded by adults. Daniel was born in mid-July of the late 2000s in Poland. When he was still very young, his mother brought him to the United Kingdom, hoping for stability after the breakdown of her marriage. Daniel's father was no longer part of his daily life, and the household that remained would soon become defined by volatility, alcohol, and fear. Daniel was a shy child, small for his age, and spoke almost no English. To many professionals who encountered him, he appeared withdrawn but unremarkable. That perception would prove fatal. By the time Daniel began attending primary school in Coventry, his body was already sending signals of severe neglect. Teachers noticed that he moved slowly, as though each step required effort. His clothes often hung loosely from his frame. He rarely spoke, rarely cried, and seemed strangely disconnected from pain. But it was his hunger that alarmed people the most. Daniel did not eat like other children. He devoured food with desperation, choking as he swallowed too fast. He took scraps from classmates, searched through trash bins, and picked crumbs from the floor. On more than one occasion, bread crusts were found hidden in his pockets, as if he were afraid that food might disappear if he did not guard it. Staff documented what they saw. Notes were written, concerns were raised, but explanations were always ready. Daniel's mother, Magdalena Luczak, insisted her son had developmental issues, claimed he was naturally small, and blamed cultural differences or misunderstandings. She presented herself as cooperative, polite, and overwhelmed. Her partner, Mariusz Krezelek, was far less approachable. His presence was described as intimidating, and professionals often left the home feeling uneasy but uncertain. Behind closed doors, Daniel's life bore no resemblance to childhood. He was routinely isolated in a bare room, separated from his siblings. Food and water were withheld as punishment. He was forced to squat for long periods until his legs collapsed beneath him. Bath time became another tool of control, with Daniel held underwater as discipline. These were not moments of lost temper. Investigators later concluded the abuse was deliberate, sustained, and systematic. Despite frequent contact with authorities, the danger Daniel faced was never fully recognized. Police responded to repeated domestic incidents at the address. Medical professionals observed bruises and signs of neglect. Teachers saw starvation unfolding day by day. Yet no one connected the fragments. Language barriers were rarely addressed. Daniel, who could not clearly express himself in English, was never consistently provided with an interpreter or a safe way to communicate. Adults spoke around him about him, but never truly with him. As the months passed, Daniel's body weakened further. By early spring of the following year, his condition was critical. He weighed little more than a toddler half his age. On a Friday, when Daniel failed to appear at school without explanation, no immediate alarm was raised. Somewhere inside the home, Daniel suffered a devastating blow to the head. Medical experts would later identify numerous injuries across his body, many concentrated around his skull. The damage to his brain was severe and irreversible. What followed was not panic, not regret, but indifference. Daniel was left on a soiled mattress in a dark room. No attempt was made to seek help. No effort was taken to check his breathing or comfort him. For more than a full day, Daniel lay unconscious, his body slowly shutting down. Only the next morning did his mother call to emergency services. Her voice was calm, almost detached. Paramedics arrived to a scene that stunned even experienced professionals. Daniel was emaciated, bruised, and unresponsive. The state of his body told a story far larger than a single injury. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was far too late. A forensic examination later confirmed that while the head injury caused his death, prolonged starvation had left him unable to survive even moderate trauma. In the home, investigators found food stored away untouched by Daniel. His room showed clear signs of long-term isolation and neglect. The criminal trial that followed exposed the depth of the cruelty inflicted on Daniel. Prosecutors described a household ruled by control and punishment, where a child was treated as a burden rather than a human being. Both Magdalena Lukak and Mariusz Krezolek were found guilty of Daniel's murder. The judge described the case as one of exceptional brutality and sentenced each of them to life imprisonment, with decades to be served before any possibility of release. But the sentence did not bring closure. Within a few years, both abusers were dead. Magdalena took her own life in prison, leaving behind no explanation and no apology. Not long after, Krezolek was found dead in his cell with authorities citing natural causes. Neither served more than a small fraction of their punishment. In the aftermath, a comprehensive review laid bare the systemic failures that allowed Daniel to die. Agencies worked in isolation. Warning signs were treated as individual issues rather than parts of a larger pattern. Professionals admitted they had been misled, intimidated, or uncertain how to proceed. Most devastatingly, the review concluded that Daniel Pelka had effectively been invisible. Public reaction was swift and furious. Vigils were held, calls for reform echoed across the country. Proposals were made to strengthen mandatory reporting laws and improve interagency communication. While not all proposed changes became law, Daniel's case reshaped safeguarding training throughout the United Kingdom. Greater emphasis was placed on recognizing chronic neglect, addressing language barriers, and understanding that quiet children can be the most vulnerable. Daniel Pelka was more than a victim. He was a gentle child who loved superheroes, who tried to learn a new language, and who endured suffering without the words to explain it. He lived among adults who assumed someone else was watching. He waited for help that never came. His story endures as a warning and a responsibility. It reminds us that abuse does not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it whispers through hunger, silence, and fear. Protecting children requires more than procedures. It demands attention, courage, and the willingness to act when something feels wrong. Daniel's life was short, but the lessons it leaves behind must never be forgotten. When United States Marshals arrived at a narrow row house in Southeast Washington District of Columbia, they believed they were there for a routine eviction follow-up. A door knock, a signature, maybe an argument, nothing more. But the moment the front door cracked open, the plan collapsed. The smell came first. It was thick, sour, unmistakable. The kind of odor that does not belong to a lived-in home. When Banita Jacks appeared in the doorway wearing a white t-shirt stained with dark patches, she tried to shut the door almost immediately. That single motion told the marshals everything they needed to know. They forced their way inside. What they found was not neglect frozen in time. It was decay that had been allowed to breathe for months. Upstairs, silence ruled. In one bedroom, 3 small bodies lay side by side, placed with unsettling intention. They were little girls dressed alike in white t-shirts, arranged almost neatly, as if someone had tried to create order out of catastrophe. In another room, the oldest child lay alone on the floor, unclothed, her body surrounded by dried blood. A knife rested nearby. A white t-shirt had been tucked beneath her. All 4 children were dead. They had been dead for a very long time. Medical examiners would later say the remains were severely decomposed, some already reduced to skeletal fragments. These were not recent deaths. These were children who had vanished from the world slowly, quietly, while the city moved on around them. The house had become a tomb. To understand how something this horrific could happen, investigators had to look backward, far before the marshals ever knocked on that door. Banita Jacks had not always been alone. Years earlier, she lived with her partner, Nathan Fogel Jr., the father of her 2 youngest daughters. When he died after a battle with cancer, her life began to unravel. Friends later described her as withdrawn, paranoid, isolated. She stopped trusting doctors. She stopped answering calls. She stopped letting the outside world see inside her home. Most dangerously, she stopped bringing her children to school. One by one, the girls disappeared from classrooms. Teachers noticed. Social workers noticed. Reports were filed. A charter school social worker grew so concerned about the absence of the oldest daughter that she went to the house herself, accompanied by a police officer. No one answered the door. Banita Jacks refused to engage. More reports followed. Hotlines were called. Notes were made, but nothing connected. No agency took full ownership. Follow-ups were missed. Visits were delayed. Somewhere between paperwork and procedure, 4 children slipped through every crack. Inside the house, reality collapsed completely. After her arrest, Banita offered explanations that shifted constantly. She spoke of demons. She claimed her daughters were possessed. She described the oldest as wicked. Sometimes she said the children died peacefully in their sleep. Other times she denied knowing how they died at all. Her words spiraled further from logic the longer she spoke. What never changed was this. She never asked for help. She never called for medical assistance. She never reported a single death. She lived with their bodies. Because of the advanced decomposition, medical examiners could not determine an exact cause of death for every child. But they did find clear evidence of violence. The oldest girl had stab wounds to her abdomen. Blood patterns suggested a prolonged struggle. The younger children showed signs consistent with blunt force trauma and strangulation. The medical examiner ruled all 4 deaths homicides. What exactly happened inside that house during those final months remains partially unknown. Investigators believe the deaths occurred over time, not all at once. They know the oldest child died violently. They know the younger girls were harmed. They know Banita remained inside the home, continuing daily life surrounded by death. At trial, prosecutors argued that isolation was not accidental. It was essential. By cutting herself off from schools, housing officials, medical providers, and social services, Banita created a sealed environment, one where no one could intervene. Her attorneys attempted to explore an insanity defense. Banita refused. She insisted she was mentally competent. She insisted she understood the proceedings. She insisted the children had not been murdered. That refusal changed everything. There would be no jury trial. Banita waived her right. The case would be decided by a judge alone. Every piece of evidence, every photograph, every medical report, every contradictory statement would be weighed without emotional sway. The judge listened to the full story. He considered the injuries, the timeline, the months of silence, the absolute abandonment of parental responsibility. He rejected the explanations. He rejected the denials. Banita Jacks was found guilty. 4 counts of felony murder, 3 counts of premeditated first-degree murder, multiple counts of child cruelty. At sentencing, the courtroom was heavy with grief. Prosecutors spoke not only about the violence, but about something even more haunting, how little the system knew about the children themselves. Investigators struggled to find details about their personalities, their interests, their daily lives. Not because they were unloved in the beginning, but because they had been erased so completely. Much of what remained came from a funeral program, favorite television shows, beloved characters, small fragments of childhood that survived when nothing else did. The judge sentenced Banita Jacks to 120 years in prison, served consecutively. No parole, no reduction. The aftermath exposed a different kind of horror. Multiple agencies had failed. Reports had gone unanswered. Visits had not occurred. Warnings had been documented but not acted upon. The city launched investigations. Employees were fired. Policies were rewritten. Information sharing was improved. But reforms came too late. Those girls were gone. In the end, this was not a story about demons or madness or mysterious illness. It was the story of isolation weaponized, of neglect allowed to grow unchecked, of a mother who closed the door to the world and turned her home into a grave. The most terrifying part is not how long the bodies remained undiscovered. It is how many chances there were to stop it. Because the monster was not hiding in the dark. She answered the door. In the middle of the 20th century, rural New York was a place where neighbors knew each other, and doctors relied more on tradition than technology. When an infant died suddenly in their sleep, there was a name for it that offered comfort rather than answers. Crib death, what we now call sudden infant death syndrome. It was mysterious, heartbreaking, and most importantly, unquestioned. Juanita Hoyt was born in the mid-1940s into a poor family in upstate New York. By all accounts, she was quiet and unremarkable. She married young, barely into adulthood, to a man named Timothy Hoyt. To outsiders, their life looked ordinary. A modest home, a young couple, plans for a family. Nothing about Juanita suggested danger. Her first child, a baby boy named Eric, was born not long after the wedding. He lived only a few months. One winter morning, he was found unresponsive in his crib. Doctors ruled it a sudden infant death. The community rallied around the young parents. There were prayers, casseroles, whispered condolences. No one questioned the diagnosis. Within months, Juanita gave birth again, this time to a daughter, Julie. She too died before reaching the age when most babies begin to sit up on their own. The explanation did not change. Another tragedy, another loss attributed to fate. The sympathy deepened. The suspicion did not. A third child followed, then a fourth. then a fifth. Each baby was born healthy. Each baby died within months. Each death was ruled natural. By the time the pattern was complete, 5 infants were buried, all from the same household and all under the same explanation. Whispers did begin. People wondered how one family could be so unlucky, but the science of the time offered no alternative. Doctors reassured the parents that some families were simply cursed by chance. And Juanita played her role perfectly. The grieving mother, the woman marked by loss, the victim of unimaginable sorrow. What no one saw was that these deaths were not sudden. They were deliberate. For decades, Juanita Hoyt lived freely. She divorced, remarried, moved on. She even became a foster parent and later adopted a child who survived into adulthood. To neighbors, she was a woman who had endured more pain than most could imagine. In reality, she was one of the most prolific child killers in American history. The truth began to surface only when medical science caught up. By the late 20th century, researchers studying sudden infant death syndrome realized something unsettling. While one unexplained infant death was tragic, but possible multiple deaths in the same family were extraordinarily rare. 5 deaths crossed the line from improbable to almost impossible. A local prosecutor revisited the Hoyt cases. Old files were reopened. Death certificates were reread with modern eyes. Investigators noticed how consistently the babies had died at nearly the same age under nearly identical circumstances. What once looked like fate now looked like design. When police brought Juanita in for questioning, she was living a quiet, unremarkable life. At first, she denied any wrongdoing. She insisted she was a victim of cruel chance. But hours into the interrogation, the mask slipped. Her confession shocked even seasoned detectives. She admitted that she had killed each of her children. She described smothering them with household items, whatever was nearby. Blankets, pillows. She said the crying overwhelmed her. She said she needed it to stop. There was no dramatic explanation, no moment of madness, just repeated conscious decisions. At trial, the defense argued that Juanita was mentally limited, easily influenced, and pressured into confessing. But the jury could not ignore the weight of her own words combined with the staggering statistical reality. 5 infant deaths, 1 mother, 1 home. She was convicted of multiple counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars. She would never be released. Fate, however, intervened again. Only a few years into her sentence, Juanita Hoyt died from cancer, taking with her any deeper explanation for why she did what she did. The impact of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. Medical professionals were forced to reconsider how sudden infant deaths were classified. Prosecutors nationwide began re-examining cases once dismissed too quickly. A single mother's crimes reshaped how both medicine and law approached the death of a child. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Hoyt case is not the number of victims. It is the betrayal. Babies cry because they trust someone will come. Their cries are not manipulation. They are survival. For most parents, that sound triggers protection and love. For Juanita Hoyt, it triggered violence. Her story is remembered today not just as a series of murders, but as a warning. Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it weeps alongside you. Sometimes it accepts your sympathy, and sometimes it is mistaken for tragedy for far too long. 5 lives ended before they truly began. 5 graves, 1 mother, and a truth that waited decades to be seen. In Oklahoma City, nestled among quiet cul-de-sacs and well-kept lawns, the Andrew family had long appeared to be the kind of household people admired. Brenda Evers. Andrew, born in the early 1963, was the picture of a devoted suburban mother. She sang in church, baked for school events, and smiled widely during Sunday service. Her husband, Rob Andrew, worked steadily in advertising, brought home a stable income, and adored their 2 children. To outside eyes, they were the kind of family that made Middle America feel safe. But appearances, as this case would prove, were nothing more than a carefully polished mask. Brenda had grown restless in her marriage long before the truth came tumbling out. The routine of parenting, budgeting, and suburban predictability smothered her. She wanted admiration, luxury, and the thrill of bending people to her will. And she found exactly that in James Pavat, a former insurance salesman and fellow member of their church community. What began as flirtation shifted quickly into a full-blown affair built on equal parts desire and ambition. Behind closed doors, Brenda and James did more than whisper sweet promises. They studied insurance policies. They pored over financial documents. Rob Andrew carried a life insurance policy worth several $100,000, and both Brenda and James knew that killing him would unlock the kind of freedom and money they craved. By the late 1990s, their plan had already begun to take shape. As Brenda drifted further from her husband emotionally, their marriage cracked and then fractured. The couple eventually separated. Rob, ever the responsible parent, tried to keep things stable for the children. He visited regularly, remained calm through arguments, and continued to support them financially. Brenda, meanwhile, was already deep into the conspiracy that would end his life. On the evening of Saturday, November 21st of the year 2001, Rob returned to the house he once shared with Brenda. He came to collect personal belongings, not knowing that Brenda and James had spent weeks preparing an ambush inside the garage. Brenda told him that something was wrong with the furnace and that he needed to take a look. It was the perfect setup, an enclosed space, a simple distraction, and no witnesses except the one person she trusted to pull the trigger. As Rob stepped into the dim garage, a shotgun blast erupted. The first shot tore into his arm. The second struck his torso. He fell to the cold concrete, bleeding and struggling for air. While he lay dying, Brenda stood nearby, watching the man she had married choke on his final breaths. Investigators would later argue that she showed no panic, no remorse, only calculation. Inside the house, her two children heard the explosions echo through the walls. They were young, confused, and trapped inside the nightmare their mother had orchestrated. After the attack, Brenda called emergency services and spun a story that masked intruders had stormed the property. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. The home had been staged. The security system had been tampered with. And most telling of all, Brenda displayed a strange lack of fear for someone who claimed armed intruders had just murdered her husband. As detectives dug deeper, a web of deceit began to unravel. They discovered Brenda's romantic relationship with James Pavat. They learned that Brenda had talked about the life insurance payout with multiple acquaintances. They found receipts, staged alibis, and suspicious phone records connecting the two conspirators. Authorities also noted how Brenda's behavior immediately after Rob's death seemed rehearsed rather than devastated. When evidence tightened around them, Brenda didn't stay to fight the charges. She fled. She gathered her two children and ran across the border into Mexico, dragging them through a life of constant motion and fear. For months, they stayed in cheap motels, moving from town to town while American law enforcement closed in. Eventually, in the year 2002, Mexican authorities detained Brenda, and she was extradited back to Oklahoma. Her trial 2 years later turned into a national spectacle. Prosecutors portrayed Brenda as a cold, sexually manipulative killer who used her beauty and charm to sway men into doing her bidding. They argued she had orchestrated every detail of Rob's murder and had used her children as unwilling witnesses in her deadly plan. The most emotional moments of the trial came when her son and daughter testified. They described hearing the shotgun blasts. They recalled their mother acting strangely calm afterward. Their voices trembled as they recounted memories they could barely comprehend at the time. The jury found Brenda guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. She was sentenced to death, becoming the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. James Pavat received the same punishment. But Brenda's story did not fade with the verdict. Over the next 2 decades, her case stirred controversy far beyond Oklahoma. Appeals lawyers argued that the prosecution had relied heavily on sexualized character attacks, mocking her clothing, displaying her underwear in court, and using degrading language to portray her as immoral. In early 2025, the United States Supreme Court ruled that some of those tactics may have violated her constitutional right to a fair trial, sending the case back for further review. As of mid-2025, federal courts were reconsidering whether Brenda should receive a new trial or whether her conviction and death sentence would remain in place. Supporters claim she was condemned not solely for murder, but also for failing to fit society's expectations of womanhood. Critics argue the evidence, her affair, the insurance documents, the staged crime scene, the flight to Mexico, paints the picture of a woman who did far more than step outside traditional roles. Today, Brenda Andrews sits in the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, the only woman awaiting execution in Oklahoma. Her name evokes anger, confusion, and disbelief. Was she a mastermind who orchestrated her husband's killing with cold precision, or a woman tried in a courtroom shaped by misogyny? Whatever the legal future holds, one truth remains intact. A husband lost his life. Two children lost the father they loved, and an entire community witnessed how far a mother could go when greed and manipulation outweighed every trace of humanity. Brenda Andrew didn't snap in a moment of rage. She didn't break under pressure. She planned, plotted, and executed a murder with chilling clarity. And the shadow of that night of those two gunshots echoing through the walls still lingers over everyone her choices destroyed.